In the blistering heat of the early Bronze Age, long before the rise of Akkad, before the pyramids reached their full glory, and even before the first kings of Sumer etched their names into stone, there existed a civilization whose brilliance slipped through the cracks of time, a people called the Avarim, who built their world on the cliffs of obsidian mountains where clouds curled like sleeping serpents over their rooftops. That Avarim were unlike any other society of their age because they did not bow to the sun or fear the moon or wage endless wars for land. Instead, they worshipped knowledge like a god. They carved equations into temple walls. They trained their children to read winds, decode star maps, understand echo vibrations in stone chambers, and shape metal with a precision other cultures would not achieve for 2,000 years. Their city, Avashta, gleamed with bronze towers and aqueducts that curled around the cliffs like liquid copper, carrying water from glacier peaks to the terraces where their people thrived. Every traveler who stumbled across their world described it as impossible, a place built by minds too sharp for their time, a society that hid its strength in silence. And yet, despite their peaceful nature, the Avarim were far from fragile. They had secrets buried deep in their archives, manuscripts and weapons forged in secrecy, quiet inventions, created to defend themselves from the ambitions of rival empires growing in the lowlands. Their greatest rival was a brutal rising force known as the Kurukan Dominion, a war machine of iron-skinned soldiers, siege beasts, enslaved miners, and kings who believed the world belonged to whoever could crush it fastest. The Kurukan scouts had heard whispers of Avashta, of a city beyond the mountains that glowed in the night with bluish fires, of scholars who shaped storms and architects who built towers resistant to quakes, and greed twisted their leaders' hearts until they vowed to take the city for themselves. But the Avarim were not blind. They had spies among the traders, informants hidden behind flute songs, coded messages carried through the valleys by trained falcons. And so their high council knew long before the enemy ever marched that their ancient peace was coming to an end. Still, they refused panic. Instead, the Avarim readied their minds, consulted their stone tablets, deciphered meteor patterns, and began constructing weapons that no other civilization could even dream about. Their leader, High Scribe Avalon, was a man with silver eyes rumored to see further than any mortal. He gathered the brightest minds into the Hall of Echoes, a massive chamber carved into the heart of the mountain where sound itself behaved differently, where whispers traveled like thunder and ideas struck walls like sparks. Avalon laid out the truth. The Kurukan Dominion was coming, and their army outnumbered the Avarim 10-1. The council gasped, but Avalon simply smiled because numbers had never frightened their people. The Avarim believed the mind was a weapon sharper than any blade. Soon, artisans forged mirror shields polished to reflect sunlight into beams strong enough to blind charging soldiers. Engineers built resonance cannons, wooden tubes lined with metal rings that amplified sound waves into force strong enough to knock down siege towers. Herbalists developed smoke that caused illusions to swirl before enemy eyes. And star readers predicted the exact valleys where fog would descend thickest on the day of battle. But even with all these preparations, the Avarim remained calm, teaching their children to meditate each morning, reinforcing the belief that strength came not from fear but from clarity. Meanwhile, the Kurukan Dominion gathered its armies, a roaring mass of warriors beating drums like thunderclaps as they crossed deserts, cut through forests, and marched relentlessly toward the obsidian cliffs. Villagers along the way whispered that the Avarim would fall within a day because who could stand against the Dominion's war beasts that dragged iron carts with tusks sharper than scythes, or against archers who could pierce a man from 100 paces. But the Avarim were not building for strength. They were building for precision, and deep inside the mountain, Avalon activated a final creation, an enormous mechanism carved of gears, gemstones, and rotating discs called the Heart of Valors. Its purpose was known only to him in the ancient manuscripts, and he swore that if the Kurukan Dominion ever stepped foot on Arim soil, the heart would awaken. As the enemy climbed the lower slopes of the cliffs and camped under the shadow of Avashta, the night sky crackled with tension. The young Avarim warriors, trained not in brute force but in strategy and discipline, lined the terraces, watching torches flicker below like a swarm of fire ants. Their stomachs twisted not from fear but anticipation, knowing the fate of their hidden civilization balanced on a blade-thin moment. Avalon stood at the highest terrace, cloak fluttering in the cold mountain wind, eyes fixed on the horizon where the first Kurukan banners appeared at dawn. The air buzzed with static as the Heart of Valors pulsed faintly inside the mountain, sending a tremor through the ground as if something ancient and powerful had taken its first breath in thousands of years. And when the Kurukan horns thundered across the valley announcing the start of a war that would reshape history, Avalon whispered a single command to his people. Hold the line, trust the mind, and prepare to show the world why the Avarim were destined to outsmart every empire that ever dared challenge them. The first stone rolled loose from the cliffs. The first battle cry echoed across the terraces, and in that moment, the lost civilization stepped out of legend and into war. The sun rose like a blade slicing through the mist, casting long golden streaks down the obsidian cliffs as the Kurukan Dominion advanced with the silent confidence of conquerors who believed victory was already theirs, their armored boots thundering across the valley floor as if they meant to shake the mountain loose from its roots. The Avram warriors stood on carved terraces high above them, their mirror shields catching the first light, and scattering it across the cliffs in shimmering arcs that looked like reflections of stars trapped in stone. Avalon watched with sharp, steady eyes as the Dominion's front lines formed rigid ranks, their warbeasts snarling, their siege machines groaning under the weight of iron plates and chained counterweights. He could feel the mountain humming beneath him, the heart of Valor's awakening deeper within its core, pulsing like a giant stone heart filled with ancient memory. Yet there was no room for hesitation. Avalon raised his hand, and the Avram archers stepped forward, their bows carved with runes that focused wind pressure, their arrows tipped not with simple bronze but with crystalline shards that fractured light into violent bursts. The first volley soared through the air silently, then burst into blinding flashes upon striking the Dominion's front lines, disorienting their soldiers and scattering the charge before it could even begin. But the Kurukan Dominion did not falter. They roared, rallied, and released their own arrows, hundreds of them darkening the sky like a swarm of locusts descending upon the terraces. The Avram held their mirror shields firmly, reflecting sunlight into the oncoming arrows and causing many to splinter mid-air, while the rest clattered harmlessly against stone. The Dominion's war general, a towering brute named Herak Steelborn, bellowed curses from atop his armored beast, his voice rising above the chaos as he ordered his siege towers forward. The towers rolled across the valley, iron wheels screeching, wooden beams reinforced with bone and metal, and from within them spilled troops carrying grappling hooks and ladders. Avalon gave a quiet nod, and the engineers of Avashta activated their resonance cannons, large wooden tubes lined with alternating metal rings that hummed with vibration when struck by a hammer. The first cannon unleashed a deep, rippling blast that cracked the ground like an earthquake, throwing Dominion soldiers backward and causing the nearest siege tower to wobble violently before collapsing in a thunderous crash. The Kurukan warriors roared in fury, unleashing heavier weaponry, including boulders launched from primitive catapults, each wrapped in flaming pitch. The sky turned red as fireballs streaked upward toward the terraces, but the Avram star readers had already predicted the wind patterns. The boulders veered off course, smashing against the cliffs instead of striking the city. Still, the Dominion pressed onward, climbing with grappling hooks that latched onto the terraces. Avram warriors met them at the edges, not with brute force but with precise strikes, knocking enemies off balance and sending them tumbling hundreds of feet. One young warrior, Telmar, fought with the calm of a seasoned strategist, stepping lightly along the terrace edge as he parried a Dominion blade, using its own momentum to hurl the attacker off the cliff. But even as victories scattered across the terraces, the Dominion's numbers were overwhelming, and their persistence terrifying. They adapted quickly, shielding their eyes from the mirror flashes, adjusting their formations, and pushing upward with ruthless determination. Avalon felt the tremor in the mountain deepen, a call from the heart of Valus, urging him closer to the moment when its full power would need to be unleashed. Yet he hesitated, knowing that activating the heart meant risking a force so old and so unpredictable that even the Averum did not fully understand the consequences. Still, the enemy was climbing higher, their elite units scaling the central terraces where the scholars and engineers had positioned themselves. The Dominion archers found new angles, launching volley after volley that began to pierce through the Averum defenses. Smoke from burning pitch drifted upward, stinging eyes, and for the first time, the warriors of Avashta felt the weight of exhaustion. The Kurukan general bellowed another command, and more war beasts were released. Massive tusked creatures dragging iron-plated rams meant to smash through the lower gates. The ground shook beneath their steps as they charged, but the Averum herbalists opened clay jars filled with shimmering blue smoke that wafted downward, curling around the charging beasts. The creatures slowed, stumbled, then recoiled in terror as visions danced before them, illusions crafted by the smoke to disrupt their senses. Chaos rippled through the Dominion ranks as the beasts turned on their own handlers, trampling soldiers and snapping chains. The Avrams seized the moment, raining arrows and sound blasts down on the disoriented enemy. But Herak Steelborn rallied his troops again, his voice booming across the valley like a war horn. He led the charge himself, scaling the cliffs with terrifying strength, dragging a massive spiked hammer behind him. Avalon watched him climb, recognizing that the general's presence changed the momentum of the battle. The Dominion surged with renewed fury, battering their way up the terraces, drawing closer and closer to the inner gates of Avashta. Avalon's pulse quickened as he realized the truth. The heart of Valus would have to be awakened fully. He retreated into the mountain-esque core with a small group of scribes while Telmar and the frontline warriors held the terraces at all costs. The deeper Avalon went, the louder the hum became, vibrating through the stone around him until his bones felt like tuning forks. The cavern housing the heart glowed with ancient light as gears rotated slowly. Gemstones pulsed with stored energy, and carvings along the walls shifted like living script. Avalon pressed his palm to the central disk, feeling the mechanism react instantly, spinning faster, releasing waves of energy that rippled through the mountain. Outside, as Herak Steelborn reached the main terrace and roared his challenge, the ground trembled violently. A crack split the cliffside as the heart of Valus awoke. and a deep ancient power surged upward, ready to reshape the fate of both empires in an instant. The air shimmered, the stones vibrated, and for the first time in millennia, the lost civilization prepared to reveal the secret that had kept them unconquered for ages. In the final age of the Erathai, when sandstorms prowled the desert like living beasts and rival empires sharpened their spears in secret, the city of Cardoon stood as the last untouched jewel of the ancient world, guarded by knowledge no invader had ever deciphered. Word spread across the continents that the unseen kingdom held inventions surpassing bronze and stone, that its scholars had crafted devices capable of bending light, tracking stars with impossible precision, predicting flood cycles before any river stirred. The Akkad Dominion marched first, convinced sheer numbers would crack the desert stronghold. But their scouts vanished into shifting dunes engineered by Erathai wind towers that redirected storms with calculated precision, burying entire battalions overnight. When the survivors crawled home raving about whispering winds and moving sands, the other empires learned fear but not caution. The Lami Confederacy tried diplomacy coded in deceit, offering trade, marriage pacts, and alliance against the rising city-state of Salakar. But the Erathai elders read the tremors of intent through their ancient Abad tablets, deciphering micro-expressions and pulse rhythms as if reading open scrolls, exposing every lie before it was spoken aloud. When Lami spies attempted to infiltrate disguised as pilgrims, the city's shadow mathematicians tracked their foot patterns on the dust-coated stone, seeing the unnatural weight distribution of trained assassins, and they were quietly removed before sunset, their blades, never drawn, their plans never echoing beyond the stone gates. But nothing tested Cardwan like the Seleucid Empire itself, the most brutal, relentless force of the era, a machine of conquest that devoured whole nations without slowing. Their ruler, King Mardukon, was obsessed with the Erathai, convinced that the secret to immortality lay somewhere in their archives, both terrified and enthralled by rumors that they had discovered ways to preserve knowledge for millennia using crystal memory tablets. Seleucid armies marched at dawn, their obsidian armor swallowing sunlight, their drums shaking the dunes, their war fans breaking the horizon like living mountains. Yet the Erathai did not panic. They did not gather armies or flee to hidden tunnels. Instead, they activated the final stage of their oldest design, the mirror grid. A network of polished quartz towers aligned with the sun's path. When the Seleucid forces reached the valley, believing they had cornered the city, the towers rotated in perfect synchronization, focusing sunlight into thousands of blinding beams that disoriented the elephants, panicked the cavalry, and sent the entire first wave spiraling into chaos. The Erathai had no interest in slaughter, so the beams were calibrated not to kill but to dismantle. Armor superheated and cracked, weapons fell from numb hands, and war machines warped under the intense, controlled heat. The invaders, terrified of a force they could neither fight nor comprehend, retreated in frantic disorder. Mardukon refused to accept defeat. In the dead of night, he gathered 300 elite warriors and approached the city through the northern ravines, where the towers cast no light. But the Erathai had anticipated this too. The ravine floor was etched with resonance patterns, vibrating stones that responded to footsteps, transmitting sound into the listening chamber deep inside Cardoon. Before Mardukon even reached the halfway point, Erathai guardians emerged from the shadows, cloaks shimmering like mirages, their presence silent and unthreatening yet impossible to bypass. Instead of killing him, they spoke. They told him that the Erathai did not seek to rule, conquer, or dominate, only to preserve knowledge and maintain equilibrium between rising civilizations. They offered him a choice: turn back and let his empire grow at its natural pace, or attack again and trigger the final safeguard that would erase Cardoon from existence forever, taking its secrets with it. Mardukon, driven by pride and fear of appearing weak, swore he would return with an army so massive it would blot out the sun. The Erathai bowed their heads as if expecting that answer. 3 months later, the Seleucid Empire gathered the largest army ever recorded in their era. They marched with hundreds of elephants, chariots, archers, and siege towers, determined to shatter the desert and the people within it. But when they reached Cardoon, the city was gone, not conquered, not burned, not abandoned. Gone, as if it had never existed. The walls had dissolved into dust, the towers vanished, the streets reduced to faint outlines in the sand. The entire city had collapsed into the earth through a series of underground chambers engineered centuries earlier as a failsafe. The Erathai civilization erased itself rather than let its knowledge fall into violent hands. No bodies were found, no survivors, no artifacts, but a few broken shards of crystal that hummed with faint energy. The Seleucid Empire, shaken by a power beyond conquest, retreated silently. Over centuries, the story transformed into myth, then legend, then forgotten whispers buried under new wars and new empires. But somewhere beneath the dunes in halls, where light still bends unnaturally and air still hums with forgotten equations, the Erathai wait, alive or not, preserved or transformed, their final message etched in crystal for those wise enough to uncover it. Knowledge is power, but wisdom is restraint, and no empire built on domination will ever outlast those who choose disappearance over surrender. What should we make next, bro? Want the thumbnail prompt, tags, or a full YouTube description for this series?